The rain had just stopped over San Francisco, leaving the city's steep hills glistening like polished marble under the dim afternoon light. From his floor-to-ceiling windows on the 42nd floor, Jonathan Carver watched droplets race down the glass, each one carrying the weight of another meaningless day. The silence in his penthouse was so complete it felt suffocating, broken only by the methodical ticking of an antique grandfather clock that had belonged to his father, a man who'd built the Carver fortune from nothing but ambition and steel will. I don't know where you're listening to this story from. Maybe you're in your kitchen, stirring coffee while the morning news drones on, or perhaps you're driving through your own city, wondering when life stopped feeling alive. It doesn't matter what time it is, or what weighs on your heart tonight, but I promise you something. Today's story will remind you that miracles still happen, even in the coldest corners of our world. Jonathan's reflection in the window showed a man who had everything money could buy. Custom Italian suits that cost more than most people's cars, a watch that could fund a small business, investments in tech stocks and cryptocurrency that grew larger by the hour. Yet, his eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who'd lost the only treasure that truly mattered. The penthouse stretched behind him like a museum of success, marble floors that echoed every footstep, abstract paintings worth millions, and furniture so pristine it looked untouched by human warmth. But it was the silence that defined this place most of all, a silence that had grown thicker with each passing year, wrapping around Jonathan like invisible chains that bound him to his grief. Jonathan Carver hadn't always been this way. 15 years ago, he'd been a different man, still driven, still ambitious, but his Manhattan corner office used to echo with the sound of a child's laughter during school holidays. His daughter, Emma, would spin in his leather chair while he worked on merger deals and stock portfolios, her fiery red hair catching the light as she chattered about her art classes and piano recitals. She had a small scar on her left hand, a butterfly-shaped mark from when she'd fallen from her bicycle at age 6, and Jonathan used to trace it gently while reading her bedtime stories. But success has a price, and Jonathan had paid it without realizing the cost until it was too late. The hostile takeover of a pharmaceutical company, the expansion into European markets, the aggressive pursuit of every profitable venture, it consumed him completely. He missed Emma's school plays, her birthday parties, the quiet moments when she needed her father most. The distance between them grew like a chasm, filled with expensive gifts and empty promises. When Emma turned 16, she made a choice that shattered Jonathan's world. She asked to live with her aunt in Oregon, away from the cold marble halls of their Fifth Avenue mansion. "I don't know who you are anymore, Dad," she'd said, her voice breaking with the weight of years of neglect. "You built this empire, but you forgot to build us." Those were the last words they'd spoken face to face. Now she was 28, married, living a life 3,000 miles away, a life that didn't include the father who'd chosen boardroom victories over bedtime stories. His wealth had multiplied exponentially over the years, real estate investments, tech startups, even early positions in Bitcoin that had made him hundreds of millions. But every dollar felt like another brick in the wall between him and the daughter he'd lost through his own ambitions. The fog was rolling in from the Pacific when Jonathan decided to take one of his rare walks through the city. His driver had offered to take him anywhere he wanted, but something about the gray afternoon called to him, a restlessness that even his climate-controlled penthouse couldn't soothe. He walked down California Street, past the cable car tracks and the boutiques that catered to tourists, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the wet pavement. The air smelled of salt and rain, and for the first time in months, Jonathan found himself noticing the world around him, the way the fog clung to the tops of buildings, the distant sound of foghorns from the bay, the warmth spilling out from coffee shops where ordinary people lived, ordinary connected lives. It was outside Mission Dolores, the old Spanish church that had stood in the same spot for over 2 centuries, that he first saw her. A small girl, no more than 9 or 10, sat on the stone step selling flowers from a cardboard box. Her clothes were clean but worn, patched at the elbows and cuffs, and her dark hair hung in simple braids that framed a face so open and trusting it seemed to belong to another century. Wildflowers spilled from her box, daisies, bachelor buttons, sprigs of lavender that filled the air with their gentle fragrance. She looked up as Jonathan approached, and her smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Would you like a flower, sir?" she asked, her voice soft with just the hint of an accent that spoke of generations who'd called this neighborhood home. She held up a single white daisy, its petals perfect, despite being plucked from some hidden garden or vacant lot. Jonathan stopped, not because he wanted a flower, but because something about the child's presence felt like stepping into a warm room after hours in the cold. But Jonathan Carver hadn't built a financial empire worth $800 million by indulging in sentiment. His first instinct was to dismiss the girl with the casual indifference he showed to all street vendors and sidewalk entrepreneurs. He learned long ago that the city was full of people with their hands out, looking for an easy mark in an expensive suit. "You're wasting your time here, kid," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had intimidated countless business rivals. "This neighborhood's not exactly Wall Street. You'd make more money selling those flowers outside the financial district." The little girl, Maria, though he didn't know her name yet, didn't flinch at his dismissive tone. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with dark eyes that seemed far too wise for such a young face. "I don't sell them for money," she said simply, still holding out the daisy. "I give them to people who need to remember that beautiful things still grow, even in the hardest places." Her words hit Jonathan like a physical blow, not because they were profound, but because they were spoken with such unshakable certainty. He found himself looking more closely at the child, taking in details he'd initially missed, the careful way she'd arranged her flowers, the small wooden cross hanging from a thin chain around her neck, the fact that her cardboard box had no price list, no indication that this was actually a business transaction. "What kind of game are you playing?" he asked, his voice sharper now, defensive in the way of men who'd learned to suspect kindness as another form of manipulation. But Maria simply smiled, an expression so free of guile it made Jonathan feel suddenly ashamed of his cynicism. "No game," she said, "just flowers." She set the daisy down on the church steps beside her and went back to arranging the others, humming softly to herself, a melody that seemed to make the gray afternoon a little brighter, though Jonathan would have denied such foolishness if anyone had suggested it. Over the following weeks, Jonathan found himself walking past Mission Dolores more frequently than he cared to admit. He told himself it was coincidence that his daily routes through the city naturally brought him to this corner of the Mission District. But truthfully, something about the little flower girl had lodged in his mind like a splinter, not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. Each time he saw her, Maria would offer him the same gentle greeting, the same outstretched flower, the same serene acceptance when he inevitably walked past without stopping. She never seemed discouraged by his rejections, never tried to pressure him with desperate sales tactics or heart-tugging stories about needing money. She simply existed in that space outside the old church, a small constant in the shifting chaos of the city, radiating a kind of peace that Jonathan had forgotten could exist. One foggy Thursday afternoon, he surprised himself by actually pausing when she offered him a sprig of lavender. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his voice gruffer than he'd intended. "Day after day, sitting here with flowers that most people ignore. What's the point?" Maria considered his question seriously, as if no adult had ever bothered to ask her before. "My mama works 3 jobs," she said finally, "cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast at the diner on Mission Street, taking care of Mrs. Rodriguez's babies in the afternoon. She's always tired, always worried about rent and groceries and whether my shoes will last another month." She paused, selecting a perfect purple blossom from her collection. "But when I bring her flowers, when I put them in that old mayonnaise jar on our kitchen table," she smiles. Really smiles, not the tired smile she puts on for other people. And I think maybe if flowers can do that for her, they can do it for other people too. The simplicity of her answer left Jonathan momentarily speechless. In his world of complex financial instruments and multi-billion-dollar acquisitions, such straightforward motivation seemed almost alien. Yet something about Maria's explanation resonated in a part of his heart he'd thought long dead. As autumn deepened into winter, their brief encounters became a ritual Jonathan looked forward to despite himself. Maria never asked personal questions, never pried into his obvious wealth or wondered aloud why a man in $1,000 suits spent so much time walking through her working-class neighborhood. Instead, she shared small stories about the family of cats that lived behind the church, about the way morning fog made different flowers smell stronger or softer, about the old woman who came to early mass every day and always stopped to admire Maria's collection. One December morning, when the air was sharp with the promise of rain and Christmas lights had begun appearing in shop windows, Maria did something that changed everything. Instead of offering Jonathan a flower, she held out a small piece of paper, folded carefully into a square. "I made this for you," she said simply. Jonathan took the paper, expecting perhaps a child's drawing or a handwritten note asking for money. Instead, he found himself looking at a remarkably detailed pencil sketch of his own face. Not flattering exactly, but honest in a way that made his breath catch. The drawing showed him as Maria saw him, tired eyes above sharp cheekbones, expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the weight of loneliness he carried, hands that looked strong but somehow empty. But it was the small detail in the corner that made Jonathan's vision blur with unexpected tears. Maria had drawn a tiny flower growing through a crack in concrete, its petals reaching toward a shaft of sunlight. Below it, in careful block letters, she'd written, "For when you're ready to grow again." That night, for the first time in 15 years, Jonathan Carver called his daughter Emma. The phone rang 4 times before her familiar voice answered, older now, cautious, but still unmistakably his little girl. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to tell you something. I need to tell you I'm sorry." The conversation with Emma lasted 3 hours, stretching through the night as father and daughter tentatively began to rebuild bridges that pride and hurt had burned years earlier. She was living in Portland now, teaching art to elementary school children, married to a kind man who built furniture with his hands and didn't care that his father-in-law was worth more than some small countries. They had a daughter of their own, Jonathan learned, 5-year-old Sophie, who loved to paint and sing and climb trees in the backyard of their modest colonial house. "She asks about you sometimes," Emma admitted near the end of their call. "She sees your picture on my dresser and wants to know why Grandpa lives so far away." The guilt in Jonathan's chest felt like drowning, but underneath it was something else, hope, fragile and tentative, but real. "I'd like to meet her," he said quietly, "if you'd let me. If you think I've learned how to be better." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jonathan could hear the careful consideration in her silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but not unkind. "Maybe we could start with video calls. Let Sophie get used to the idea of having a grandfather who wants to know her. And Dad?" She paused, and he could almost see her tucking a strand of red hair behind her ear the way she'd done as a child. "I'm proud of you for calling. It couldn't have been easy." After they hung up, Jonathan sat in his pristine living room, watching the city lights twinkle through his floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it felt pregnant with possibility, as if the world had cracked open just enough to let something new grow through. He thought about Maria's drawing, still folded carefully in his jacket pocket, and realized that the little flower seller had given him more than art. She'd given him permission to believe that broken things could heal, that roots could find soil even in the hardest ground. But transformation is never a straight line. And Jonathan's journey toward redemption was about to face its greatest test. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a warmth that seemed to promise new beginnings. Jonathan had been visiting Maria regularly now, sometimes bringing coffee for himself and hot chocolate for her, sitting on the church steps while she arranged her flowers and shared her gentle observations about the world. He'd learned that she lived with her mother Rosa in a small apartment above a laundromat, that she attended St. Monica's elementary school, that her favorite subject was art because colors tell stories that words can't. Their friendship had become a bright spot in Jonathan's carefully ordered days, a reminder that connection didn't require complexity, that sometimes the most profound relationships bloomed from the simplest soil. But Rosa Santos had been watching her daughter's new friendship with growing unease. A single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and rent paid, she'd learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. Rich men didn't befriend poor children out of kindness, not in her experience. There was always an angle, always something they wanted that money couldn't simply buy. One evening in March, as Jonathan was saying goodbye to Maria after sharing stories about his upcoming video call with his granddaughter Sophie, Rosa appeared on the church steps like a storm cloud gathering force. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the space with protective fury. "Stay away from my daughter," she said, her voice low but crackling with intensity. "I don't know what game you're playing, but Maria doesn't need your kind of help." Jonathan felt the accusation hit him like a physical blow. In Rosa's eyes, he could see every stereotype she'd constructed around men like him, predators in expensive suits, people who saw children like Maria as either charity cases or something worse. "It's not what you think," he tried to explain, but Rosa cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I know exactly what I think," Rosa continued, her voice rising with each word. "You think you can buy your way into our lives, make yourself feel better about whatever guilt is eating at you, and then disappear when you get bored. Well, my daughter is not your redemption project." The words stung because they held just enough truth to wound. Hadn't he initially dismissed Maria as another street vendor? Hadn't his first instinct been to mock her innocence? Rosa's accusations forced Jonathan to confront the uncomfortable possibility that his motives weren't as pure as he'd convinced himself they were. "You don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. "Maria has helped me see things differently. She's taught you." Rosa's laugh was bitter, full of years of exhaustion and disappointment. "She's 9 years old. She shouldn't have to teach grown men how to be human. That's not her job." Behind her mother, Maria watched the confrontation with wide, frightened eyes. For the first time since Jonathan had met her, the child's serene confidence seemed shaken. She clutched her box of flowers against her chest like a shield, and Jonathan realized, with a sick feeling in his stomach, that their friendship had somehow become a source of stress rather than joy in her young life. "Maybe your mother is right," he said softly, speaking directly to Maria now. "Maybe I've been selfish, thinking about what you've given me without considering what this friendship might cost you." Rosa nodded sharply, satisfied that her point had been made. "Come on, mija," she said to Maria, extending her hand. "We're going home." As they walked away, Maria turned back once to look at Jonathan, her expression confused and sad. That single glance haunted him for weeks afterward, a reminder that good intentions could still cause harm, that the line between healing and selfishness was thinner than he'd ever imagined. For the first time since their friendship began, Jonathan stayed away from Mission Dolores, convinced that Rosa was right, that he'd been using Maria's innocence to heal wounds that were his responsibility to address alone. 3 weeks of absence stretched into a month, and Jonathan found himself falling back into old patterns of isolation. His video calls with Emma and Sophie continued, bringing moments of genuine joy as he slowly built a relationship with the granddaughter he'd never known. Sophie was a bright, curious child who inherited her mother's artistic talents and her grandfather's stubborn streak. She would hold up her paintings to the computer screen, chattering about the stories behind each colorful creation, and for those precious minutes, Jonathan felt connected to something larger than his own regrets. But the absence of Maria's gentle presence left a hole in his daily routine that he hadn't expected. Walking past Mission Dolores became an exercise in willful blindness, eyes straight ahead, pace quick and determined, trying not to notice whether a small figure still sat on the church steps selling flowers to an indifferent world. It was Emma who finally forced him to confront what he was avoiding. During one of their weekly calls, she noticed his distraction, the way his attention seemed to drift, even while Sophie was showing off her latest masterpiece, a painting of a garden where every flower had a different colored face. "Dad, what's wrong?" Emma asked after Sophie had skipped away to help her father in his workshop. "You seem, I don't know, sadder than usual." "And that's saying something." Jonathan found himself telling her about Maria, about their friendship and Rose's accusations, about his fear that he'd been selfishly using a child's kindness to heal his own emotional wounds. Emma listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful as the story unfolded. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd heard. "Do you love her?" she finally asked. "Not romantically, obviously, but do you genuinely care about this little girl's well-being, or is she just a mirror for your own needs?" The question hit Jonathan like a lightning bolt, forcing him to examine his motives with painful honesty. Did he love Maria? The answer came immediately, rising from a part of his heart he'd thought permanently closed. Yes, he realized. He loved her fierce gentleness, her unshakable faith in beauty, her ability to find joy in the smallest moments. He loved the way she made him want to be better, not for what she could give him, but for what she deserved from the world. The revelation came to Jonathan on a Tuesday morning in late May, delivered not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet accuracy of a child's wisdom. He'd been working in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports and dividend statements, when Mrs. Chen from the building's front desk called to say someone had left a package for him. The envelope was small and manila-colored, addressed in the careful block letters he'd learned to recognize as Maria's handwriting. Inside was another drawing, but this one was different from the portrait she'd given him months earlier. This sketch showed two hands, one large and weathered, one small and delicate, holding a single flower together. Both hands bore small scars, and beneath the image, Maria had written, "Some flowers need two people to hold them so they don't break." Jonathan felt his breath catch as he studied the drawing more closely. The scars on the hands weren't random artistic details. They were specific, intentional. The larger hand showed a thin line across the knuckles, exactly matching a scar Jonathan had carried since childhood when he'd fallen from his bicycle and scraped his hand on concrete. The smaller hand bore a butterfly-shaped mark that made his heart stop completely. It was Emma's scar, the one he used to trace gently during bedtime stories, replicated with impossible accuracy by a child who had never seen his daughter's hand. But Maria couldn't have known about either scar. Jonathan had never mentioned Emma during their conversations, had never shown Maria any photographs or shared stories about his lost relationship with his daughter. Yet somehow, this 9-year-old girl had drawn two scars that held the deepest meaning in Jonathan's life, the mark of his own childhood vulnerability and the symbol of the daughter he'd failed to protect. The impossibility of it should have made him skeptical, should have triggered his businessman's instinct to look for logical explanations. Instead, Jonathan felt a profound sense of recognition, as if Maria's drawing had revealed a truth he'd been too blind to see. She wasn't just a kind child who'd wandered into his life by accident. She was something more. A messenger, a bridge, a small miracle disguised as a flower seller on the steps of an old church. That afternoon, Jonathan did something he hadn't done since childhood. He went to Mission Dolores not to walk past it, but to enter it. The interior of the church was cool and dim, filled with the scent of candle wax and centuries of prayers. Stained glass windows cast colored light across wooden pews, where generations of families had celebrated births and mourned losses, had made promises, and asked for forgiveness. Jonathan sat in the back row, Maria's drawing clutched in his hands, and tried to remember the last time he'd actually prayed. The words came haltingly at first, rusty with disuse. He found himself talking to whatever presence might be listening, not asking for miracles or impossible reversals, but simply acknowledging gratitude for the small girl who'd shown him that beauty could grow anywhere, that kindness didn't require explanation, that love was always worth the risk of loss. When he emerged from the church 20 minutes later, he found Maria sitting on the steps with her box of flowers, just as she'd been that first day months ago. But something was different now. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, as if the confrontation with her mother had dimmed some essential light inside her. "Hello, Mr. Jonathan," she said softly, not looking up from the daisy she was examining for imperfections. Her voice carried a formal distance that hadn't been there before, a careful politeness that broke Jonathan's heart. "Hello, Maria," he replied, settling beside her on the stone steps without waiting for permission. "I've missed you." She glanced up at him then, her dark eyes searching his face for sincerity. "Mama says you might not be safe for me to know." Jonathan nodded slowly, understanding Rose's protective instincts even as they wounded him. "Your mama loves you very much. She wants to protect you, and that's what good mothers do." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But sometimes, Maria, the most dangerous thing we can do is stop believing that good people exist in the world." From his jacket pocket, Jonathan withdrew Maria's latest drawing, unfolding it carefully so she could see her own artwork. "How did you know?" he asked simply. Maria studied the image she'd created, her small fingers tracing the outlines of the two scarred hands. For a long moment, she didn't answer. And Jonathan wondered if she even understood the impossibility of what she'd drawn. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, older than her 9 years. "Sometimes I dream about people," she said. "Not like regular dreams, but like looking through a window into their hearts. I dreamed about you before I ever saw you, Mr. Jonathan. I dreamed about a man who was carrying a flower that had broken stem, trying to hold it together with just his hands." She pointed to the scar on the larger hand in her drawing. "This is where you broke when you were little, when you learned that the world could hurt you. And this one," she touched the butterfly-shaped mark, "this is where someone you love got broken, and you couldn't fix it. And it made you feel like you'd failed at the most important job in the world." Jonathan felt tears beginning to blur his vision, but Maria wasn't finished. "The flower in my dream was wilting, because it needed 2 sets of hands to hold it properly. One person alone couldn't keep it alive, no matter how much they wanted to." She looked up at him with those impossibly wise eyes. "I think the flowers love Mr. Jonathan, and I think maybe God sent me to help you remember how to hold it without breaking it more." The simplicity and truth of her words undid something fundamental in Jonathan's chest. For the second time in his adult life, he wept openly, not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen, truly known by another human being. Maria scooted closer on the church steps and patted his shoulder with the gentle confidence of someone far older than her years. "It's okay," she whispered. "Love is supposed to make us cry sometimes. That's how we know it's real." In the months that followed, Jonathan's transformation accelerated with the momentum of a man who'd finally found his true purpose. His first step was approaching Rosa Santos with the humility of someone who'd learned the difference between charity and genuine care. He found her at the diner where she worked morning shifts, serving coffee and eggs to construction workers and early commuters who barely looked up from their phones long enough to say thank you. Rosa's posture stiffened when she saw him enter, but Jonathan didn't approach her table immediately. Instead, he ordered coffee and sat quietly in a corner booth, waiting for her break time with the patience of someone who'd learned that meaningful conversations couldn't be rushed. When Rosa finally joined him, her expression wary but not entirely hostile, Jonathan spoke without preamble. "You were right to protect her," he said. "If I had a daughter Maria's age, I would have reacted exactly the same way." Rosa studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or false sincerity. "But?" she prompted, because there was clearly more he needed to say. But Maria sees things the rest of us miss, Jonathan continued. She has a gift, not just for kindness, but for healing. And I think maybe she was meant to cross paths with people like me, people who've forgotten how to hope. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a bank envelope, placing it carefully on the table between them. This isn't payment for her friendship. It's not charity. It's a scholarship fund that I'm establishing in Maria's name for children in the Mission District who show artistic talent, who might benefit from art supplies, music lessons, or educational opportunities their families can't afford. Rose's eyes widened as she saw the amount on the check, $50,000, enough to change dozens of young lives. But Jonathan wasn't finished. I want you to manage the fund, he said. You know this community. You understand which children need help most. Maria would be the first recipient if she's interested in art classes or if there's anything she needs for school. For the first time since they'd met, Rose's defensive posture softened slightly. Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this? Jonathan thought about Maria's drawing, about the miraculous accuracy of those two scarred hands, about the way a child's wisdom had unlocked doors in his heart he'd thought permanently sealed. Because she taught me that miracles aren't always big, dramatic events. Sometimes they're as simple as a little girl who sees the best in people, even when those people have forgotten how to see it in themselves. The Carver Foundation for Arts Education was officially established 6 months later, housed in a renovated building just 3 blocks from Mission Dolores. Jonathan had purchased the abandoned warehouse using a fraction of his cryptocurrency portfolio, transforming it into a bright, airy space where children could paint, draw, sculpt, and dream without worrying about the cost of supplies or instruction. Maria was indeed the foundation's first official student, but she was quickly joined by 24 other neighborhood children whose talents had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Jonathan found himself spending more time at the foundation than in his downtown office, watching small miracles unfold daily as shy children discovered they could create beauty, as struggling families found a safe space for their kids after school, as the community began to heal old wounds through the simple act of making art together. Rosa eventually became the foundation's director, her protective instincts and intimate knowledge of local families making her the perfect advocate for the children they served. The scholarship fund grew steadily as Jonathan liquidated assets and redirected his considerable wealth toward projects that built rather than merely accumulated. But perhaps the most profound change was in Jonathan's relationship with his own family. Emma and Sophie made their first trip to San Francisco just before Christmas, staying not in Jonathan's sterile penthouse but in a warm, book-filled apartment he'd purchased in the Mission District, close enough to the foundation that Sophie could visit during their week-long stay. The little girl fell in love with Maria immediately, and watching them paint together, one blonde head and one dark bent-over shared canvases, Jonathan finally understood what Emma had meant all those years ago when she'd accused him of building an empire, but forgetting to build them. Love wasn't something you constructed through grand gestures or expensive gifts. It grew organically, tended with daily attention, nurtured by presence rather than presence. Sophie's artwork began incorporating flowers into every piece, daisies and lavender sprigs that clearly showed Maria's influence. And when Emma asked her daughter why, Sophie's answer was pure 5-year-old wisdom. Because Maria says flowers remember how to be beautiful even when nobody's watching, and I want my pictures to remember too. On a foggy morning in early spring, exactly 2 years after their first meeting, Jonathan found Maria on the church steps as always, but this time she wasn't alone. Emma and Sophie had come with him for what had become their monthly visit to San Francisco. And all 3 generations of carvers sat together on the stone steps while Maria shared her latest artistic creation, a large canvas painting that showed a garden where children and adults worked side by side, tending flowers that seemed to glow with inner light. "It's us," Maria explained, pointing to different figures in the painting. "All of us, taking care of the beautiful things so they can take care of other people." In the center of the garden stood a tall man with kind but tired eyes, his scarred hands gentle as he helped a little girl plant seeds in rich, dark soil. Around them, the garden bloomed in impossible colors, purples and golds and crisp whites that seemed to pulse with life. But it was the background that took Jonathan's breath away. In the far distance, barely visible unless you looked carefully, stood a young woman with red hair and a butterfly-shaped scar on her hand, smiling as she watched the scene unfold. Emma noticed the figure at the same moment her father did, and her sharp intake of breath made Sophie look more closely at the painting. "Who's that lady, Maria?" Sophie asked innocently. "She looks like my mama." Maria's smile was radiant as she answered, "That's the flower that learned how to bloom again. She's watching to make sure the garden grows exactly the way it's supposed to." Later, as they walked through the Mission District together, 4 generations connected by bonds that transcended blood or circumstance, Jonathan reflected on the mysterious alchemy that had transformed his life. His fortune was smaller now, redistributed through foundations and scholarships and community programs that turned money into opportunity. His penthouse sat empty most days while he spent his time in places that mattered: the art center, Emma's kitchen table in Portland, the park where Sophie liked to collect interesting rocks and fallen leaves. The grandfather clock in Jonathan's apartment still ticked with mechanical precision, marking the passage of hours and days with its steady rhythm. But time felt different now, not like something to be conquered or efficiently managed, but like a gift to be shared generously with people who mattered. His investment portfolio had evolved too, shifting from aggressive growth strategies to sustainable funds that aimed to build better communities rather than simply maximize returns. The Bitcoin windfall that had made him hundreds of millions now funded clean water projects and educational initiatives across 3 continents. His board of directors initially questioned these philanthropic redirections, but Jonathan's patient explanations gradually won them over. "Wealth that isn't shared becomes its own prison," he told them during one particularly heated meeting about his latest charitable commitment. "I spent 15 years learning that lesson the hard way." Maria continued to sell flowers outside Mission Dolores, but now her offerings were supplemented by art supplies donated through the foundation. Children from the neighborhood would stop by to paint with her on sunny afternoons, turning the church steps into an impromptu outdoor studio where creativity bloomed as freely as the daisies and lavender in her cardboard box. Rosa had initially worried that the foundation might change her daughter's essential nature, might make her feel special in ways that could corrupt her gentle spirit. Instead, the opposite happened. Maria's gift for seeing beauty and potential in unexpected places seemed to grow stronger with each passing month, as if having resources to help others amplified rather than diminished her natural wisdom. She began writing letters to Jonathan's business contacts, simple notes that accompanied her drawings, and somehow convinced hardened executives to fund art programs in schools they'd never visited. Her influence spread through networks of power and money like seeds carried on favorable winds, taking root in hearts that had been closed to such possibilities. One evening in late summer, as Jonathan sat in his Mission District apartment reading bedtime stories to Sophie over video call, he noticed something that made him pause mid-sentence. On his desk, clearly visible in the camera frame, was Maria's original drawing, the portrait she'd given him that first winter, showing his tired face alongside a small flower growing through concrete. Sophie had apparently been studying the image during their conversation because she suddenly asked, "Grandpa, is that you when you were sad?" The question caught Jonathan off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so accurate. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly. "That's me from before I learned how to be happy again." Sophie nodded with the serious consideration that children bring to important topics. "Who taught you?" she asked. Jonathan glanced at the drawing, remembering that first day when Maria had offered him a daisy with the simple faith that beauty was worth sharing even when the recipient couldn't recognize its value. "A little girl who sees miracles everywhere," he answered honestly. "She taught me that you don't have to wait for big magical things to happen, Sometimes the most important magic is just choosing to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. From Portland, Emma's voice joined the conversation. And sometimes the magic is having people who love you enough to wait while you figure out how to love them back. The three-way exchange continued for another hour. Grandmother sharing memories, father offering reassurance, granddaughter contributing the kind of observations that only 5-year-olds can make with perfect sincerity. When they finally said goodnight, Jonathan found himself looking around his apartment with fresh eyes, not the sterile showcase it had once been, but a real home filled with evidence of connections that mattered. Sophie's artwork covered one entire wall, a rotating gallery that changed with each visit. Emma's photographs were scattered across surfaces, documenting the life she'd built despite his absence. And Maria's drawings were everywhere, gentle reminders that healing was always possible when approached with an open heart and willing hands. The fog was rolling in from the Pacific, just as it had that first afternoon when Jonathan encountered Maria outside Mission Dolores. But now, 3 years later, he walked through the same streets with a different rhythm, not the hurried pace of a man fleeing his own emptiness, but the measured gait of someone who'd learned to notice beauty in unexpected places. The Carver Foundation had grown beyond anything he'd initially imagined, expanding to include music programs, scholarship funds for promising students, and community gardens where families could grow their own flowers and vegetables. Maria, now 12 and still wise beyond her years, had become its unofficial ambassador, her artwork decorating the walls and her gentle presence reminding visitors that creativity and kindness were the Foundation's true mission. Jonathan's financial advisors had initially predicted that his philanthropic commitments would eventually compromise his business empire. Instead, the opposite proved true. Companies wanted to partner with someone whose reputation for ethical leadership had spread throughout the San Francisco business community. His investment strategies, guided by principles of sustainability and social responsibility, generated returns that satisfied both his profit margins and his conscience. The penthouse had been sold months earlier, its proceeds funding an expansion of the Foundation's youth programs. Jonathan now lived in a comfortable but modest apartment within walking distance of both the Foundation and Mission Dolores, in a neighborhood where shopkeepers knew his name and children waved from playground swings as he passed. His morning routine included stops at Rosa's Diner for coffee and conversation, brief visits to check on the Foundation's daily activities, and always, weather permitting, a few minutes on the church steps where Maria still maintained her small flower stand. But the most profound change was one that couldn't be measured in dollars or documented in Foundation reports. Jonathan had learned to sleep peacefully, without the ambient noise machines or prescription medications that had once been necessary to quiet his anxious thoughts. His dreams, when he remembered them, were filled with gardens and laughter, with children's voices and the scent of flowers growing in impossible places. This morning was different, though. Maria wasn't on the church steps when Jonathan made his usual rounds. Rosa mentioned at the diner that her daughter was working on a special project, something she'd been planning for weeks, but had kept mysteriously secret from everyone, including her mother. Intrigued and slightly concerned, Jonathan spent the day wondering what Maria might be creating, remembering how her previous artistic surprises had invariably contained layers of meaning that revealed themselves slowly, like flowers opening to sunlight. The answer came just before sunset, when a small hand knocked on his apartment door. Maria stood in the hallway, holding a wrapped package that was clearly a painting, her dark eyes bright with excitement. "I finished it," she announced, following him inside without waiting for an invitation. "The painting I've been working on all summer. It's for you, but it's also for everyone." She unwrapped the canvas with ceremonial care, revealing a work that took Jonathan's breath away. The painting showed the church steps where they'd first met, but transformed into something that transcended realistic representation. The steps flowed upward like a waterfall in reverse, carrying flowers and children and light toward a sky that seemed to pulse with golden warmth. At the bottom of the steps sat a man in an expensive suit, his face turned upward with an expression of wonder and hope. Around him, flowers grew from cracks in the concrete, their roots visible beneath the surface, drawing nourishment from sources both seen and unseen. But it was the inscription at the bottom of the canvas that made Jonathan's vision blur with grateful tears. In Maria's careful handwriting, she'd written, "For Mr. Jonathan, who taught me that grown-ups can learn to believe in miracles too. And for everyone who thinks it's too late to bloom again, love finds a way." The painting was beautiful beyond anything Jonathan could have imagined, but it was also something more. It was a testament to the journey they'd shared, a reminder that transformation was always possible when approached with faith and genuine connection. "Maria," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She beamed at his reaction, then grew more serious as she explained her real purpose in creating the artwork. "I want to give it to the foundation," she said, "so people who visit can see it and remember that everyone has seeds inside them, waiting for the right time to grow." Jonathan nodded, understanding immediately why the painting belonged in the space where so many children had discovered their own creative potential. But as he looked more closely at Maria's latest masterpiece, he noticed details that made him marvel once again at her mysterious ability to see beyond the surface of things. Hidden throughout the composition were tiny portraits of the people whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work, children who'd discovered they could paint, single mothers who'd found community and support, elderly volunteers who'd rediscovered purpose in helping others create beauty. In the very center of the flowing cascade of steps and flowers, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was the figure of a young woman with red hair and a distinctive scar on her hand. But this time, she wasn't standing in the distant background. She was walking down the steps, her arms outstretched, her face radiant with joy as she moved toward the man waiting at the bottom. "That's your daughter," Maria explained matter-of-factly. "She's coming home." Jonathan felt his breath catch, not because he believed in prophecy, but because Maria's words carried the weight of inevitable truth. Emma had indeed been planning a surprise, one that Rosa had helped coordinate in secret. In 3 weeks, she and Sophie and her husband David would be moving to San Francisco, where David had accepted a position with a sustainable furniture company, and Emma would be taking over the day-to-day operations of the Foundation's educational programs. The circle would be complete, father and daughter reunited not through dramatic gestures or forced reconciliation, but through the gradual rebuilding of trust and the shared commitment to something larger than their own relationship. That night, Jonathan called Emma to tell her about Maria's painting and its remarkable prediction. They talked for 2 hours, sharing memories and dreams and plans for the future, their conversation weaving together past pain and present joy into something that felt like forgiveness made audible. And so we come to the end of this story, though really it's not an ending at all, but a transformation, the kind that happens when broken hearts learn to beat in rhythm with something larger than their own wounds. Jonathan Carver still walks the streets of San Francisco, but now his footsteps carry the weight of purpose rather than the burden of regret. His fortune, though smaller in absolute terms, generates returns measured in children's laughter and community gardens and families who've found their way back to each other through the simple miracle of shared creativity. Maria continues to sell flowers outside Mission Dolores, but her cardboard box now overflows with art supplies, donated by grateful families whose children have discovered their own gifts through the Foundation's programs. She's 13 now, poised between childhood and adolescence, but her essential wisdom remains unchanged, that quiet certainty that beauty exists everywhere, waiting to be noticed and nurtured by those with eyes to see and hands willing to tend. Emma and her family settled into San Francisco life with the ease of people returning home rather than relocating to somewhere unfamiliar. Sophie started kindergarten at St. Monica's, the same school Maria had attended, and their friendship deepened into the kind of bond that transcends age differences when shared values create common ground. David's furniture workshop became a gathering place for artists and craftspeople, a space where the foundation's older students could learn practical skills while creating beautiful, functional objects for their community. The foundation itself has become a model for other cities, its success demonstrating that sustainable change happens not through grand gestures, but through daily commitment to values that prioritize people over profit, connection over competition. Jonathan serves on its board but no longer dominates its decisions, having learned the difference between leadership and control, between involvement and interference. Rosa leads the foundation now with the fierce love and practical wisdom that first made her so protective of her daughter. She's expanded its mission to include programs for parents and grandparents, recognizing that children thrive when their entire families feel supported and valued. But perhaps you're wondering about the deeper mystery that runs through this story. Maria's uncanny ability to see into hearts, to know things that couldn't be taught or explained through ordinary means. Jonathan never found a rational explanation for her gifts, and eventually he stopped looking for one. Some questions are more beautiful when they remain mysteries, when the wonder of not knowing preserves space for faith and possibility. What he knows for certain is that Maria entered his life at exactly the moment when he most needed to remember that miracles aren't always dramatic interventions in the natural order. Sometimes they're as simple as a child who chooses kindness over cynicism, who offers beauty without expecting anything in return, who believes so completely in the possibility of healing that her faith becomes contagious. The scarred hands in Maria's drawings, his own and his daughter's, were never about supernatural knowledge, but about the deep human truth that we all carry wounds that make us recognizable to one another. Suffering, when met with compassion rather than bitterness, becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. The flower growing through concrete was never meant to be a literal miracle, but a metaphor for resilience, for the stubborn insistence of life to find ways to bloom even in the hardest circumstances. And love, the broken flower that needed two sets of hands to hold it properly, was never about romantic fairy tales, but about the simple acknowledgement that the best things in life require collaboration, patience, and the willingness to keep trying even when previous attempts have failed. On quiet mornings now, when the fog rolls in from the Pacific and the city seems suspended between sleeping and waking, Jonathan sometimes sits on the steps of Mission Dolores and watches the world come alive around him. Children walk to school with backpacks full of books and dreams. Shop owners unlock their doors and arrange their displays with the pride of people who love their work. Neighbors greet each other with the casual warmth of a community that knows how to nurture itself. These ordinary miracles happen thousands of times each day, in every city, in every neighborhood where people choose connection over isolation, where they decide that beauty is worth creating and sharing even when no one is watching. And you, have you ever met someone small who changed your life in immense ways? Someone whose simple presence reminded you that the world still holds wonder, that kindness isn't weakness, that it's never too late to begin again? Maybe it was a child who asked you an innocent question that shattered your carefully constructed defenses. Maybe it was an elderly person whose stories helped you understand that experience is the most valuable inheritance we can leave behind. Maybe it was a stranger who smiled at exactly the moment when you most needed to remember that you weren't invisible, that your existence mattered to someone, even if only for the brief duration of a chance encounter. These meetings aren't accidents, even when they feel random. They're part of a larger pattern, a design that becomes visible only when we step back far enough to see beyond our immediate circumstances. Every person who enters our life carrying gifts of wisdom or healing or simple human recognition is both teacher and student, both messenger and recipient of messages we didn't know we needed to send or receive. Maria's flower stand outside Mission Dolores is still there, though now it's expanded into a small garden where children can plant seeds and tend growing things while learning that patience and faith are the most important ingredients in any recipe for beauty. The flowers she sells carry no price tags because Maria learned early that the most valuable things in life can't be purchased. They can only be shared freely, offered with open hands to anyone who has the wisdom to recognize their worth. Jonathan's story continues to unfold, not as a finished narrative with a neat conclusion, but as a life lived in conscious gratitude for second chances and unexpected grace. His mornings begin with coffee and conversations with neighbors who've become family. His afternoons are filled with the purposeful work of turning resources into opportunities for others. And his evenings often end with bedtime stories shared over video calls with a granddaughter who paints flowers in impossible colors and believes, without question, that love can make broken things whole again. The lessons Maria taught him weren't complicated theological concepts or sophisticated philosophical theories. They were simple truths that most of us learned as children but forgot in the process of growing up, of protecting ourselves from disappointment, of learning to measure success in terms that have nothing to do with joy or connection, or the quiet satisfaction of knowing that our presence in the world has made it a little more beautiful than we found it. The Carver Foundation's annual report for this year tells a story in numbers that would make any accountant proud. 350 children served, 215 scholarships awarded, 18 community gardens established across the city. But the real impact can't be quantified in spreadsheets or documented in quarterly statements. It lives in the confidence of a shy 10-year-old who discovered she could paint stories that made people cry with recognition, in the renewed sense of purpose felt by a grandmother who volunteers to teach origami to children whose languages she doesn't speak, but whose laughter she understands perfectly, in the quiet transformation of a neighborhood where vacant lots have bloomed into spaces where families gather to tend growing things together. Maria's influence extends far beyond the foundation's walls, rippling outward through networks of connection that span continents and cultures. Her letters, still written in that careful block printing, arrive on the desks of world leaders and corporate executives with the same frequency that they land in the mailboxes of struggling single mothers and overwhelmed teachers. Each envelope contains a small drawing alongside words that cut through complexity with the precision of perfect simplicity. Remember that beautiful things still grow, even in the hardest places. Some recipients frame these letters, others carry them in wallets and purses like talismans against despair. All of them are changed, however slightly, by the reminder that somewhere in the world, a young girl believes so completely in the possibility of beauty that she makes time in her days to share that belief with strangers. The investment portfolios Jonathan once managed with such ruthless efficiency have been transformed into tools for building rather than merely accumulating. The cryptocurrency windfall that once seemed like an abstract victory in an imaginary game now funds water purification systems in villages whose names he couldn't pronounce 5 years ago, but whose children he's seen laughing in photographs sent by grateful aid workers. The hostile takeovers that once defined his business strategy have evolved into collaborative partnerships with companies committed to sustainable practices and social responsibility. His board meetings, once exercises in competitive dominance, have become forums for creative problem-solving where the question isn't how much can we make, but how much good can we do. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, times when the pull of old patterns felt stronger than the promise of new possibilities. But each time Jonathan wavered, he would find himself walking past Mission Dolores, where a small figure with wise eyes would offer him a flower and remind him that growth requires both patience and faith, that the most important things in life can't be rushed, but must be tended with daily attention and genuine care. Emma's transition from Portland to San Francisco marked not just a geographical relocation, but a healing of wounds that had seemed too deep to bridge. The morning she and Sophie first walked through the doors of the Carver Foundation as its new educational director and most enthusiastic 5-year-old volunteer, respectively, Jonathan felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since Emma was small enough to spin in his office chair while he worked on deals that seemed so important then, but felt insignificant now in comparison to this moment of conscious reunion. Sophie's presence in the foundation brought an energy that was both chaotic and inspiring. Her paintings, displayed prominently in the main gallery, showed gardens where every flower had a different expression, where trees grew upside down because that's how they look when you're lying on your back looking at the sky, where families of all configurations tended growing things together under sunshine that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Her questions, asked with the fearless curiosity that adults spend decades trying to reclaim, challenged everyone around her to see familiar things from new angles. "Why do grown-ups always say they don't have time for beautiful things?" she asked Maria one afternoon while they painted together on the church steps. "Don't they know that beautiful things are what make time feel good?" Maria, now approaching her 14th birthday, but still carrying that serene wisdom that had first captured Jonathan's attention, considered Sophie's question with the seriousness she brought to all important topics. "I think maybe grown-ups forget that time isn't something you spend," she said finally, her brush creating delicate purple petals on the canvas between them. "It's something you share, and when you share it, making beautiful things with people you love, you get more of it somehow." Their conversation, overheard by Jonathan as he arrived for his daily visit to the foundation, became the seed for what would eventually grow into the organization's most innovative program. Intergenerational art workshops where grandparents and grandchildren, separated adult children and their parents, long estranged siblings, could find their way back to each other through the simple act of creating beauty together. The pilot program launched with 12 families, most of whom had been recommended by counselors and social workers who recognized that traditional therapy wasn't reaching the places where their pain lived. By year's end, there was a waiting list of more than 100 families, and similar programs were being established in cities across the country. David's Furniture Workshop, initially conceived as a teaching space for older students at the foundation, evolved into something much more significant: a laboratory for sustainable design where beauty and functionality merged with environmental consciousness and social responsibility. The pieces created there weren't just furniture, but statements of values, each table and chair and bookshelf carrying the story of its creation, the names of the young people who helped sand and stain and assemble it, the families who would gather around it for meals and homework and conversations that shaped character and built connections. Local restaurants and cafes began commissioning pieces from the workshop, not just because the furniture was beautiful and well made, but because each item came with a story of transformation, a testament to what became possible when young people were given meaningful work and the guidance to discover their own capabilities. The workshop's waiting list grew as word spread through the city's design community that David's students weren't just learning carpentry. They were learning to see themselves as creators, as people whose hands could shape raw materials into objects of beauty and utility that would outlast their own lifetimes. Jonathan's role in this expanding ecosystem of creativity and healing was both central and intentionally peripheral. His financial resources made most of it possible, but his emotional wisdom, hard-won through years of isolation and regret, taught him when to step back and let others lead. He attended every foundation board meeting but rarely dominated the conversation. He visited the workshop regularly but never tried to direct the work being done there. He celebrated each milestone and achievement, but understood that the best gift he could give the people whose lives he'd touched was the freedom to grow beyond his influence, to become more than he could have imagined for them. This balance between involvement and independence wasn't easy to maintain. His businessman's instincts occasionally urged him toward more active management, more direct control over outcomes he cared deeply about. But then he would see Maria arranging flowers on the church steps with the same serene confidence she'd possessed at 9. Or watch Sophie teaching a workshop participant 3 times her age how to blend colors, because Yellow and blue don't just make green, they make the feeling of spring morning. And he would remember that the most profound changes happen not when we try to control outcomes, but when we create conditions where growth becomes inevitable. Rosa's leadership of the foundation has proven inspired in ways that formal management training could never have predicted. Her intimate knowledge of the Mission District's families, combined with her protective instincts refined by years of single motherhood, made her uniquely qualified to identify which children most needed the Foundation's resources and which families would benefit from its community-building programs. But more than her practical skills, Rosa brought something to the organization that no amount of professional expertise could provide: the credibility of someone who had lived the struggles that Foundation programs were designed to address. When Rosa spoke to skeptical parents about the value of art education, they listened because she understood their concerns about whether creative programs could compete with more practical skills for their children's attention and energy. When she advocated for community garden projects in neighborhoods where vacant lots had long symbolized neglect and abandonment, residents trusted her judgment because she lived in the same apartments, shopped in the same stores, worried about the same safety concerns that affected their daily decisions. Her presentations to potential funders carried an authenticity that Jonathan's polished business pitches, no matter how well-intentioned, couldn't match. She spoke not from theoretical knowledge, but from lived experience, not about abstract social problems, but about specific families whose children played with her daughter, whose struggles she witnessed firsthand, whose triumphs she celebrated as community victories. Over the 3 years since the Foundation's establishment, Rosa had become a recognized voice in city-wide discussions about poverty, education, and community development. Her appearances at city council meetings, initially nerve-wracking experiences for someone more comfortable serving coffee than addressing elected officials, grew increasingly confident as she realized that her perspective was not only valuable, but necessary for creating policies that actually served the people they were meant to help. She began writing op-ed pieces for the city's newspapers, simple but powerful essays that challenged readers to consider whether their assumptions about struggling communities matched the reality of families working multiple jobs to maintain their dignity and pursue their dreams despite systemic obstacles. The Foundation's success attracted attention from similar organizations across the country, and Rosa found herself traveling to conferences and workshops where she shared the lessons learned from their community-based approach to arts education and family support. These speaking engagements, while honoring, never distracted her from the daily work that remained her primary focus, ensuring that every child who walked through the Foundation's doors felt welcomed, valued, and recognized for the unique gifts they brought to the community being built around them. Maria's role in the Foundation's growth was both subtle and essential. Now, 14, and possessing the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being truly seen and appreciated for who you are rather than what you might become, she moved through the organization's activities like a gentle ambassador between different worlds, adult and child, donor and recipient, skeptic and believer. Her artwork, displayed throughout the Foundation's spaces, served as a visual reminder of the organization's core values. But more importantly, her presence reminded everyone that the Foundation's work wasn't about charity or sympathy, but about recognizing and nurturing the inherent worth and creativity that existed in every person, regardless of their economic circumstances or family situation. The transformation in Jonathan's relationship with Emma continued to deepen in ways that went far beyond their physical proximity now that she lived in San Francisco. The careful reconstruction of trust between them had created something more substantial than the relationship they'd shared before it was damaged by years of mutual disappointment and hurt. This new connection was built on the foundation of who they had become rather than who they had been, shaped by forgiveness that was earned rather than assumed, and respect that acknowledged the ways each had grown during their years apart. Their weekly family dinners, held in Jonathan's Mission District apartment rather than any expensive restaurant, became sacred time where 3 generations gathered around David's handcrafted dining table to share more than food. Sophie's chatterings about her kindergarten adventures, Emma's updates about foundation programs and the families they served, David's stories about workshop projects, and the young people learning to see themselves as skilled craftspeople. These conversations wove together the ordinary details of daily life with the profound satisfaction of meaningful work and genuine connection. Jonathan's contributions to these dinners weren't the elaborate presentations he'd once believed necessary to maintain his family's attention. Instead, he shared small observations about the people he encountered during his walks through the neighborhood, updates about foundation donors who were becoming personally invested in specific programs, reflections on how different his life felt now that his days were structured around relationships and contributions rather than acquisitions and achievements. Sometimes he would bring out photo albums from Emma's childhood, images he'd rarely looked at during the years when they seemed to document his failures as a father, rather than the love that had existed alongside his misguided priorities. Now these pictures told a different story, not of perfection lost, but of connection that had survived his mistakes and was strong enough to support new growth. Emma's work as the Foundation's educational director revealed talents Jonathan had never fully recognized during her childhood. Her ability to connect with shy children, to help aggressive teenagers find constructive outlets for their energy, to create curriculum that made learning feel like play while building real skills. These gifts had developed during her years as a teacher in Portland, but they flourished in the Foundation's supportive environment, where her creativity was celebrated rather than constrained by rigid educational requirements. She initiated partnerships with local schools, bringing foundation programming into classrooms where children spent most of their waking hours, training teachers to incorporate art into math and science lessons, advocating for policies that recognized creativity as essential rather than supplemental to intellectual development. Her relationship with Maria represented something beautiful and complex, not quite sisterhood despite the difference in their ages, but a mutual recognition of shared values and complementary perspectives. Maria's intuitive wisdom balanced Emma's professional training. Emma's organizational skills helped Maria's artistic vision reach larger audiences. They collaborated on programs that neither could have developed alone, creating spaces where children felt safe to express their deepest feelings through colors and shapes and stories that words couldn't adequately convey. Sophie's adjustment to her new school and new city happened with the resilience that children display when their fundamental security remains intact. Her friendship with Maria, despite the age difference, provided a bridge between the familiar world of her Portland childhood and the exciting possibilities of San Francisco life. She appointed herself as Maria's assistant during flower-selling sessions outside Mission Dolores, chattering to potential customers about the special qualities of each bloom, creating elaborate stories about where the flowers had grown and what wishes they might grant to people who treated them kindly. Her presence at the Foundation added an element of pure joy that was both infectious and grounding. Adults who arrived, stressed about their problems, found themselves smiling at Sophie's enthusiastic greetings and her artworks that transformed any wall into a celebration of color and possibility. Children who felt intimidated by the Foundation's programs relaxed when they saw someone even younger than themselves moving through the space with complete confidence and belonging. David's integration into the Foundation community happened gradually but thoroughly. His workshop became a gathering place, not just for students learning woodworking skills, but for parents and volunteers who appreciated the meditative qualities of working with their hands, the satisfaction of creating objects that would outlast their makers, the conversations that developed naturally when people worked side by side on projects that required both individual skill and collaborative effort. He initiated a program where formerly incarcerated adults could learn marketable skills while creating furniture for low-income families, recognizing that both populations benefited from opportunities to contribute meaningfully to their community rather than simply receiving assistance. His quiet presence provided a stabilizing influence during Foundation board meetings, where his craftsman's perspective on the relationship between patience and quality helped balance more ambitious impulses with realistic timelines and sustainable growth. But perhaps the most significant aspect of David's role was the example he provided of masculinity defined by creation rather than dominance, by collaboration rather than competition. The young men in his workshop learned not just how to measure and cut and sand, but how to ask for help when needed, how to offer assistance without diminishing others, how to take pride in work well done without needing to diminish the achievements of their peers. The community that developed around Mission Dolores and the Foundation represented something rare in urban environments, a genuinely intergenerational neighborhood where people knew each other's names and stories, where children felt safe to play in streets watched by multiple caring adults, where elderly residents found purpose in sharing their skills and wisdom with younger neighbors who needed both practical guidance and emotional support. This didn't happen automatically or without effort. Rose's role as Foundation Director included community organizing that went far beyond arts programming, block parties that brought together families who might otherwise remain isolated, advocacy for better street lighting and traffic safety, connections to city services and resources that many residents hadn't known were available to them. Jonathan's presence in this community was welcomed not because of his wealth, which many neighbors discovered only gradually, but because of his consistency, his respectful manner, his willingness to contribute to shared projects without expecting to direct them. He became a familiar figure at community meetings, school board sessions, city council meetings where residents advocated for resources and policies that would improve their neighborhoods. His business experience proved valuable in helping local organizations navigate bureaucratic processes and develop sustainable funding strategies, but always in a supporting role that recognized others as the legitimate leaders of their own communities. The ripple effects of the Foundation's work extended far beyond its immediate programming. Children who developed confidence through art classes began performing better in regular school subjects. Families who connected with other parents through Foundation events formed support networks that helped them navigate challenges that had previously felt overwhelming. Young adults who learned skills in David's workshop went on to find employment with companies that valued both their technical abilities and their collaborative work habits. Elderly volunteers who shared their expertise with Foundation participants found renewed sense of purpose and connection that improved their own health and well-being. This network of positive influence attracted attention from researchers who studied community development and social change. Academic papers were written about the Foundation's models. Graduate students interviewed program participants about the long-term impacts of arts education on family stability and economic mobility. Policymakers visited to understand how community-based programming could be replicated in other cities. But for Jonathan, the most meaningful measure of success wasn't documented in research studies or Foundation annual reports. It was visible in moments too small and personal to capture in data. Sophie's artwork showing that she felt secure enough in her new home to include Jonathan in pictures of her family. Maria's continued presence on the church steps selling flowers, not because she needed the money, but because the ritual connected her to something larger than herself. Emma's laughter during family dinners that sounded like the carefree child she'd once been, before his mistakes taught her to guard her heart against disappointment. The approach of the third anniversary of Jonathan's first meeting with Maria sparked reflection about how much had changed and how much remained constant. His wealth, while considerably smaller than at its peak, generated more satisfaction because it supported work that aligned with his values rather than simply accumulating for its own sake. His home, while more modest than his former penthouse, felt more genuinely his because it was shaped by relationships and daily routines that brought meaning to each room. His time, no longer dominated by meetings and transactions that served primarily to generate more meetings and transactions, was structured around activities that left him feeling energized rather than depleted at the end of each day. The question marks that had haunted his solitary walks through the city. Who am I beyond my net worth? What legacy will I leave? How do I forgive myself for the years I wasted pursuing things that didn't matter? Had resolved not through dramatic epiphanies, but through daily choices to prioritize connection over achievement, contribution over accumulation, presence over productivity. Maria's mysterious ability to see into people's hearts and know things she couldn't have learned through ordinary conversation remained as inexplicable as ever, but it no longer seemed to require explanation. Whether her insights came from unusual sensitivity, divine inspiration, or simple wisdom that most people possessed but rarely accessed, didn't change their impact on the lives she touched. The letters she wrote to strangers around the world continued to arrive at exactly the moments when recipients most needed reminders that beauty and kindness existed in the world. The drawings she created for Foundation participants captured not just their physical appearance, but their deepest hopes and fears in ways that helped them understand themselves more clearly. The flowers she sold outside Mission Dolores continued to carry no price tags because she understood that the most valuable gifts couldn't be purchased, only offered freely to anyone wise enough to recognize their worth. As spring arrived again in San Francisco, bringing with it the annual renewal that made even longtime residents pause to appreciate the city's remarkable beauty, Jonathan found himself standing once more on the steps of Mission Dolores, watching Maria arrange her daily selection of flowers while Sophie chattered about the painting she was creating for her grandfather's apartment. The scene was both achingly familiar and completely transformed from that first encounter 3 years earlier, when a broken man had dismissed a child's kindness and nearly walked away from the miracle of connection that was being offered to him. The changes in his life were so complete that comparing his current circumstances to his former isolation felt like looking at photographs of a stranger who happened to share his face. The apartment building where he now lived hummed with the ordinary noises of families, children practicing piano, neighbors calling greetings in 3 different languages, the sounds of cooking and conversation, and life being lived in community. His morning walks took him through streets where he was known and welcomed, where shopkeepers saved newspapers they thought might interest him, and where elderly residents sitting on front steps invited him to pause for conversations about weather and politics and the small daily dramas that make up the texture of neighborhood life. The foundation had grown to serve nearly 500 children and families, but its success was measured not in expansion for its own sake, but in the depth and sustainability of the changes it facilitated in people's lives. Former program participants returned as volunteers and mentors. Parents who had initially been skeptical about the value of arts education became its most passionate advocates. Young adults who had developed skills and confidence through foundation programs found meaningful employment and went on to establish their own families in the same community where they had first discovered their potential. The partnership with local schools had evolved into a model that was being studied and replicated in districts across the state. Emma's innovative curriculum, which integrated creative expression with traditional academic subjects, produced measurable improvements in student engagement and learning outcomes while maintaining the joy and exploration that made education feel like discovery rather than drudgery. Teacher training programs brought educators from other cities to learn how to incorporate foundation methods into their own classrooms, spreading the influence far beyond San Francisco's borders. But perhaps the most profound change was one that couldn't be measured or documented: the restoration of Jonathan's capacity for hope. The cynicism that had protected him from disappointment during his years of isolation had dissolved gradually, replaced by a faith in human goodness that was both naive and sophisticated, both vulnerable and strong. He no longer assumed that kindness had hidden motives or that generosity was a form of manipulation. He no longer needed to control outcomes or guarantee returns on his emotional investments. He could love freely, trust genuinely, contribute generously without requiring proof that his efforts would produce specific results or recognition for his role in positive changes. This transformation was perhaps most visible in his relationship with Sophie, who had never known his former self and therefore related to him simply as the grandfather who showed up consistently, who listened to her stories with genuine interest, who celebrated her achievements and comforted her disappointments with the steady presence that she had every right to expect from the adults in her life. Through Sophie's eyes, Jonathan could see himself not as someone struggling to overcome past mistakes, but as someone worthy of uncomplicated love, someone whose presence added joy and security to her world, someone whose own capacity for wonder was renewed daily through her endless questions about how things worked and why people made the choices they did, and what would happen if everyone in the world decided to plant flowers instead of building walls. Her paintings, which covered an entire wall of his apartment and spilled over onto surfaces throughout the foundation, showed him not as a figure burdened by regret, but as someone surrounded by beauty and color and possibility. In Sophie's artistic vision, flowers grew from his hands, birds nested in his hair, and his smile was wide enough to hold all the happiness in the world. These images, created with the fearless optimism of childhood, gradually became more true than the harsh self-assessments that had dominated his thinking for so many years. Emma's presence in his daily life provided opportunities for healing that went beyond their regular conversations and shared meals. Working alongside her at the foundation, seeing her commitment to the children and families they served, witnessing her patience with difficult situations, and her creativity in solving problems that seemed intractable. These experiences helped Jonathan understand the woman his daughter had become during their years of estrangement, and more importantly, they revealed the ways his own parenting had contributed to her strength even when his attention was focused elsewhere. The realization that Emma's work ethic, her innovation under pressure, her refusal to accept limitations imposed by others, these qualities that made her such an effective foundation director were qualities he recognized from his own professional life, but refined and directed toward purposes that built community rather than personal empire. She had inherited his determination, but channeled it toward healing rather than dominance, had learned from his mistakes while retaining his best qualities, had become someone he could admire without reservation, and someone whose forgiveness meant more to him than any business achievement had ever mattered. Their collaboration on foundation projects provided a context for rebuilding their relationship that was both personal and purposeful. They could work through past hurts while focusing on present challenges, could learn to trust each other's judgment while pursuing goals they both cared deeply about, could enjoy each other's company while creating something larger than their individual contributions. The process of healing their relationship happened gradually and naturally, without forced conversations or artificial milestones, but through daily choices to assume good intentions, to communicate clearly about needs and boundaries, to celebrate shared victories, and support each other through inevitable setbacks. David's integration into this extended family happened with the quiet ease that characterized his approach to most aspects of life. His workshop became a second home for Jonathan, who found in the rhythms of woodworking a meditation that quieted mental noise in ways that expensive vacations and luxury purchases had never achieved. The satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful with his own hands, the pleasure of learning skills that had nothing to do with financial markets or corporate strategy, the companionship of working alongside other adults who shared knowledge generously and appreciated effort as much as results. These experiences filled spaces in Jonathan's life that he hadn't even realized were empty. The intergenerational friendships that developed in David's workshop provided Jonathan with relationships that weren't complicated by his wealth or his past reputation. The retired electrician who taught him how to use hand tools safely didn't care about his investment portfolio. The young father learning to build furniture for his growing family appreciated Jonathan's willingness to help sand and stain pieces without needing to direct the project. The grandmother, creating memory boxes for her grandchildren, valued his patient listening to her stories about the family treasures she was organizing for the next generation. These connections, based on shared activity rather than shared history, allowed Jonathan to discover aspects of his personality that had been suppressed during his years of single-minded business focus. His dry sense of humor, his surprisingly gentle touch with delicate work, his ability to encourage others without overwhelming them with advice. These qualities emerged naturally in the workshop's supportive environment, reminding him that he was more than the sum of his professional achievements and financial mistakes. The community garden project that Rosa initiated behind the foundation building became a symbol of everything the organization represented: beauty, growing from neglected space, diverse people working together toward shared goals, patience and faith rewarded with abundance that could be shared with neighbors and strangers alike. Jonathan's role in the garden was typically humble. He showed up when needed to help with heavy lifting, contributed financially to soil amendments and tool purchases, and learned alongside everyone else about companion planting and organic pest control, and the mysterious alchemy that transformed seeds and water and attention into food and flowers that nourished both body and spirit. The garden's success attracted attention from city planning departments interested in replicating the model in other neighborhoods. But for participants, its value wasn't in its potential for expansion, but in the weekly rhythms of planting and weeding and harvesting that connected them to cycles larger than their individual concerns. Children learned that food didn't originate in grocery stores, that growth required both patience and daily tending, that sharing a harvest multiplied everyone's abundance rather than diminishing individual portions. Adults discovered that working in soil was both physically grounding and spiritually renewing, that conversations about weather and plant care naturally evolved into discussions about deeper concerns, that the community formed around shared labor was stronger and more sustainable than associations based only on shared problems or shared geography. The garden's produce supplemented family meals, but more importantly, the knowledge and confidence gained through successful growing translated into other areas of participants' lives. Children who learned to tend plants with consistent care began applying the same patience to their schoolwork. Adults who saw their garden efforts rewarded with actual food began trusting their ability to make positive changes in other aspects of their lives. Families who worked side by side in garden beds found new ways to enjoy each other's company and new topics for conversation that didn't revolve around problems or disappointments. Rosa's leadership of the foundation had evolved into something that transcended traditional nonprofit administration. Her combination of practical experience and fierce advocacy had made her a respected voice in city-wide conversations about poverty, education, and community development policy. Her presentations to potential funders were remarkable not for their sophisticated graphics or polished delivery, but for their unflinching honesty about both the complexity of the challenges and the possibility of meaningful progress when resources were directed by people who understood the communities being served rather than by people who merely studied them from a distance. Her testimony before city council committees carried weight because she could speak from lived experience about the impact of policies on actual families rather than abstract populations. When she advocated for increased funding for after-school programs, she could describe specific children whose lives had been changed by having safe, supervised, enriching activities during the hours when parents were working second jobs. When she supported zoning changes to allow community gardens in residential areas, she could quantify the improvements in both nutrition and neighborhood cohesion that resulted from shared growing spaces. When she opposed budget cuts to public transportation, she could explain exactly how reduced bus service affected families' ability to access foundation programs, medical appointments, job training, and educational opportunities. Her writing, which began with simple letters to newspaper editors, had grown into regular op-ed pieces and occasional magazine articles that reached audiences far beyond San Francisco. These publications weren't academic treatises, but accessible explanations of complex social issues, personal stories that illustrated broader patterns, challenges to comfortable assumptions about poverty and opportunity, and the relationship between individual effort and structural barriers. Her speaking engagements at conferences and universities provided platforms for sharing lessons learned through the Foundation's community-based approach, but also opportunities to question the assumptions underlying traditional charity models and to advocate for policies that addressed root causes rather than simply managing symptoms. The recognition that came with these expanded roles was gratifying, but Rosa remained grounded in the daily work that had originally drawn her to Foundation leadership. She still knew the name of every child in Foundation programs, still made time for individual conversations with parents who needed support navigating school bureaucracies or social services, still insisted that program decisions be made by people who would be directly affected by their implementation rather than by board members who meant well but lacked intimate knowledge of community needs and resources. Maria's 14th birthday celebration became a community-wide event that transformed the ordinary ritual of cake and presents into something approaching a festival of gratitude for everything the young artist had brought to so many lives. The party, held in the Foundation building with doors open to the garden and workshop spaces, drew participants from every program and program families who had moved away but maintained connections to the community they'd helped create. The artwork displayed throughout the building represented not just Maria's artistic development over the past several years, but a visual history of the Foundation's evolution and the deepening relationships among people whose paths might never have crossed in any other context. The portrait she had drawn of Jonathan during that first winter hung in a place of honor, surrounded by more recent pieces that showed how her technical skills had grown while her essential vision, that beauty was everywhere, waiting to be noticed and shared, remained constant. Her gifts from community members weren't expensive purchased items, but handmade treasures that reflected the skills and creativity that flourished in the Foundation's supportive environment. A quilt pieced together from fabric scraps by elderly program volunteers, a wooden jewelry box crafted by one of David's workshop students, a cookbook compiled by garden participants, featuring recipes that incorporated the vegetables and herbs they grew together, a collection of letters from children in other cities whose communities had started similar programs inspired by news coverage of the Foundation's work. But the most meaningful gift came from Jonathan, who had worked for months with Emma and Sophie to create something that honored Maria's 3rd anniversary as the Foundation's unofficial ambassador and his own guide toward hope. The surprise was revealed when he led her to a corner of the building that had been under construction for several weeks, behind curtains that had hidden the mysterious project from curious observers. The new space was an artist's studio designed specifically for Maria's work, large windows that provided perfect natural light, storage for her growing collection of art supplies, comfortable seating for the community members who often gathered to watch her create, walls designed to display rotating exhibitions of her artwork alongside pieces by other young artists whose talents had been nurtured through Foundation programs. But the studio was more than just a workspace. It was designed as a teaching space where Maria could share her techniques and perspectives with other young artists, where intergenerational art workshops could provide opportunities for children and adults to learn from each other, where visiting artists could offer workshops and classes that expanded everyone's understanding of creative possibilities. The studio's dedication ceremony included not just the unveiling of the physical space, but the announcement of a partnership with the city's major art museums that would provide Maria and other Foundation artists with opportunities to display their work in professional galleries, to attend master classes with established artists, to participate in cultural events that had previously been accessible only to people from families with significant financial resources. These opportunities weren't presented as charity, but as recognition of talent that deserved support and audiences that deserved exposure to perspectives that were rarely represented in mainstream cultural institutions. Maria's response to these gifts was characteristic of her approach to all aspects of life, genuine gratitude combined with immediate consideration of how the resources could be shared with others who might benefit from similar support. Her brief acceptance speech, delivered to the crowd gathered in the garden behind the foundation building, was both humble and visionary. Thank you for helping me have a place to make art, but more than that, thank you for helping me understand that art isn't something you keep to yourself. It's something you share so that other people remember that beautiful things are all around us, even when life feels hard. I want this studio to be a place where everyone can come and remember that they can create something beautiful, no matter what else is happening in their lives. The celebration continued into the evening, with music provided by foundation participants who had formed bands and choirs, food prepared by families who treated the event as an opportunity to share their cultural traditions, stories told by community members about the ways their lives had been changed by their association with the foundation and the connections they had formed through its programs. Jonathan found himself moving through the gathering not as its host or primary benefactor, but as one community member among many, welcomed and appreciated but not set apart by his financial contributions or his role in the organization's establishment. The conversations he joined were wide-ranging and natural, discussions about upcoming city elections and their potential impact on education funding, debates about the best methods for starting seeds that would remain viable through the summer heat, planning for foundation programs during the school district's upcoming schedule changes, gossip about neighborhood developments and concerns about rising rents, and celebrations of graduations and new jobs and family milestones. These were the conversations of people who knew each other well enough to care about details of daily life, who felt secure enough in their relationships to disagree about issues that mattered without threatening the bonds that connected them, who had experience of mutual support that made current challenges feel manageable because they wouldn't be faced alone. The evening ended with an impromptu art-making session, as often happened when Maria was present, with adequate supplies and adequate space for creativity to flourish. Children and adults worked side by side on a large banner that would become a permanent part of the foundation building's decor, each person contributing something that represented their connection to the community that had formed around shared values and mutual support. The banner, when completed months later through sessions that included dozens of contributors, would become a visual reminder of everything that was possible when people committed to seeing the best in each other, to nurturing potential wherever it appeared, to creating beauty as a form of resistance against forces that encouraged cynicism and isolation and despair. Jonathan's contribution to the banner was characteristically modest. A small flower growing through a crack in concrete, painted in the corner among dozens of other images that were more elaborate and technically sophisticated. But the flower represented something profound about his journey from isolation to connection, from despair to hope, from wealth that was merely accumulated to wealth that was generously shared for purposes that honored the fundamental dignity and potential of every person who crossed his path. As the celebration wound down and families began the process of cleaning up and saying goodnight and making plans for future gatherings, Jonathan found himself standing once again on the steps of Mission Dolores, looking up at stars that were barely visible through the city's light pollution, but were certainly there, certainly shining, certainly part of a universe vast enough to hold both the immensity of human suffering and the miracle of human kindness, both the reality of individual loneliness and the possibility of genuine community, both the weight of past mistakes and the promise of present opportunity to build something better. Maria joined him on the steps, carrying her box of flowers as she had on that first day 3 years earlier. But everything about the scene was transformed by the relationships and understanding and shared commitment to beauty that had grown from their unlikely friendship. The flowers in her box were more varied now, contributed by garden participants and workshop members and community volunteers who understood that her daily ritual of offering beauty to strangers was both gift and service, both art and ministry, both individual expression and community representation. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it's reminded you of your own capacity for transformation or your own encounters with unexpected grace, then Maria's mission continues through your willingness to remain open to possibility. Share it with someone who needs to hear that miracles still happen, that it's never too late to bloom again, that love really can find a way to heal what seemed permanently broken. Leave a comment about your own experience with small messengers who delivered large truths, your own moments when a child's wisdom cut through adult complications and showed you a clearer path forward. Subscribe to hear more stories about the ordinary people who do extraordinary things simply by choosing to believe that kindness matters, that beauty is always worth creating, that the bonds between seemingly different people can bridge divides that seem impossible to cross. And remember, as you go about your own daily life, that you too might be someone's Maria, someone's unexpected source of hope and healing. The flowers you offer might be literal blooms or kind words or patient listening or simply the gift of your presence when someone most needs to remember that they're not alone. The seeds you plant through small acts of love and recognition will grow in ways you may never know, touching lives in expanding circles that ripple outward through time and space, creating gardens of possibility wherever they take root. The miracle isn't that these connections happen, but that they happen so often, so naturally, so generously, that we sometimes forget to notice them. Pay attention, be grateful. And when your own moments of darkness come, as they do for everyone, remember that somewhere, in some unexpected place, a small hand is extending a flower, and a gentle voice is reminding anyone who will listen that beautiful things still grow, even in the hardest ground, especially when tended by people who understand that love is the most powerful force in the universe, patient enough to work miracles one heart at a time. The years that followed brought changes both subtle and profound to the community that had formed around Mission Dolores and the Carver Foundation. Maria's transition into high school coincided with the expansion of foundation programming to include scholarship support for older students who showed promise in arts, crafts, and community service. Her quiet leadership among younger program participants earned her recognition not just within the foundation, but throughout the city's arts community, where her work was exhibited alongside that of established artists who recognized in her paintings and drawings a mature vision that transcended technical skill. Jonathan's role in these developments remained characteristically supportive rather than directive. His financial resources made many opportunities possible, but his emotional wisdom guided him to create conditions for growth rather than trying to control its direction. He attended Maria's high school art exhibitions, the same way he attended Sophie's kindergarten performances, with the genuine pride of someone whose primary interest was celebrating achievement rather than claiming credit for it. The foundation building itself had evolved to accommodate expanding programs and growing community involvement. David's workshop had become a cooperative where former students taught newer participants while developing their own businesses, creating custom furniture and home accessories. The community garden had expanded to include greenhouse facilities that allowed year-round growing and educational programming that connected environmental sustainability with economic opportunity and community health. The art studios provided spaces for classes and workshops that were open not just to program participants, but to any community members interested in developing creative skills while contributing to projects that beautified and strengthened their neighborhood. Rose's leadership of the foundation had gained recognition far beyond San Francisco, but her commitment remained grounded in the daily lives of families who depended on foundation programming for their children's enrichment, their own skill development, and the community connections that made urban life more manageable and rewarding. Her speaking engagements at conferences and policy forums provided platforms for advocating approaches to community development that were based on resident expertise rather than external assumptions about what struggling communities needed most. Her writing had evolved to include a book, part memoir, part policy analysis, part practical guide, that documented lessons learned through 5 years of foundation operations while challenging readers to examine their own assumptions about poverty, opportunity, and the relationship between individual potential and structural support. Emma's work as educational director had established models that were being replicated in communities across the country, but her satisfaction came from daily interactions with children and families whose lives were being changed through access to educational opportunities that honored their cultural backgrounds while expanding their possibilities for future growth. Her partnership with local schools had produced measurable improvements in academic achievement, but more importantly, it had created environments where learning felt joyful rather than punitive, where cultural differences were celebrated rather than seen as deficits, where family involvement was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Her relationship with Jonathan continued to deepen through shared commitment to foundation work, but also through the ordinary experiences of family life. Weekly dinners where multi-generational conversations ranged from Sophie's school adventures to Jonathan's reflections on business ethics, to Emma's analysis of educational policy, to David's observations about the intersection of craftsmanship and community building. These dinners, held in rotation among their various homes in the foundation building, had become central to all their lives, not because of any formal importance, but because they provided consistent opportunities for connection that didn't depend on crisis or celebration, but simply on the weekly rhythm of people who cared about each other choosing to spend time together. Sophie's adjustment to San Francisco life had been seamless in the way children adapt when their fundamental security remains intact. Her friendship with Maria provided a bridge between different worlds, the protected environment of childhood and the broader community where adults work to address complex challenges through collaboration and mutual support. Her artwork had grown more sophisticated while maintaining the fearless optimism that made every piece a celebration of possibility. Her presence at foundation events added joy that was both infectious and grounding, reminding adults that their work was ultimately about creating a world where children could thrive rather than merely survive. The 5th anniversary of Jonathan's first encounter with Maria was marked not by formal celebration, but by the quiet recognition that their friendship had become the foundation for a community that served hundreds of people while remaining true to the simple values that had brought them together, believing in beauty, sharing generously, remaining open to connection with people whose experiences differed from but enriched their own understanding of what it meant to live fully and love freely without guarantees, but with faith that such choices made the world more hospitable for everyone. The question of Maria's unusual insight, her ability to see into hearts and know things that couldn't be learned through ordinary conversation, had never been resolved through rational explanation, but it no longer seemed to require one. Whether her gifts came from unusual sensitivity, divine inspiration, or wisdom that most people possessed but rarely accessed, didn't change their impact on the lives she continued to touch. Her letters to strangers around the world now arrived automatically through a foundation program that connected people experiencing isolation with handmade artwork and encouraging messages created by program participants who understood from their own experience how much difference such gestures could make. Her artwork, displayed in galleries and museums, carried descriptions that identified her as a community artist whose work reflected the values and experiences of the neighborhood where she grew up rather than individual genius that developed in isolation from social context. Her teaching of younger artists happened naturally through the mentorship that occurred when different generations worked side by side on projects that served community goals while developing individual skills and confidence. The mystery of her knowledge about Jonathan's and Emma's scars had been absorbed into the larger mystery of how healing happens when people choose vulnerability over defensiveness, generosity over hoarding, faith over cynicism. Some questions became more beautiful when they remained unanswered, when the wonder of not knowing preserved space for approaches to life that couldn't be reduced to rational analysis or strategic planning. The flowers Maria still sold outside Mission Dolores continued to carry no price tags because their value couldn't be calculated in terms of economic exchange. They represented something more fundamental, the daily choice to believe that beauty was worth creating and sharing even when recipients couldn't immediately recognize its worth, even when the effort seemed small compared to the magnitude of suffering that existed in the world, even when the impact couldn't be measured or documented or leveraged into larger influence. These flowers, given freely to anyone who paused long enough to receive them, had become a symbol of everything the foundation represented: hope that was both practical and transcendent, community building that honored individual dignity while creating collective strength, investment in the future that was based on faith in human potential rather than guarantee of specific returns. Jonathan's transformation from isolated wealth accumulator to engaged community builder had been complete for years, but its implications continued to unfold in ways that surprised him with their depth and sustainability. His morning walks through the Mission District brought him into contact with families he'd known long enough to celebrate children's graduations and worry about elderly members' health and offer assistance during periods of unemployment or family crisis, not as charity, but as the natural exchange of support that characterized genuine community. His business activities, substantially reduced from their former scope, were now directed entirely toward investments that aligned with his values. Companies committed to environmental sustainability, worker ownership, community development, rather than community displacement. His remaining wealth was managed to maintain his modest lifestyle while generating ongoing resources for foundation programming and similar initiatives in other cities where community leaders had requested support for developing their own versions of arts-based community building. The satisfaction he derived from this work was entirely different from the adrenaline-driven excitement that had once motivated his aggressive business practices. Instead of conquest and accumulation, his days were structured around contribution and connection, activities that left him feeling energized rather than depleted, purposeful rather than restless, grateful rather than haunted by awareness of everything his success had cost him and others. His relationship with Emma had evolved into something neither of them had expected during those awkward early conversations when they began rebuilding trust, a collaboration based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than the complicated mixture of guilt and resentment that had characterized their previous interactions. Their work together at the foundation provided context for addressing old wounds while creating something new. Opportunities to demonstrate changed priorities through daily choices rather than grand gestures or lengthy explanations of remorse and intention to do better. The grandparent relationship with Sophie that had begun tentatively through video calls had become one of the most uncomplicated joys of Jonathan's life. Her unquestioning acceptance of his presence, her delight in sharing discoveries and questions and artistic creations with someone who had time and attention for all her enthusiasms, her assumption that he would be available for school events and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesday afternoon conversations about why flowers grow toward light and what makes some people kind while others are mean. These interactions reminded him daily that love didn't require perfection, only presence and genuine interest in the well-being of people who mattered. The broader community that had formed around the foundation represented something increasingly rare in urban environments: genuine intergenerational relationship, where people knew each other's names and stories, where children felt safe to explore and make mistakes because they were surrounded by caring adults who weren't their parents, where elderly residents found purpose in sharing skills and knowledge with younger neighbors who needed both practical guidance and emotional support. This community hadn't developed through formal programming or strategic planning, but through the accumulation of small interactions, shared meals, collaborative projects, mutual assistance during times of need, celebrations of achievements and milestones, conversations that revealed common values, despite differences in background and experience. The ripple effects of foundation programming extended far beyond its immediate participants, to include family members, friends, neighbors, and colleagues who were influenced by the confidence and skills and sense of possibility that program participants brought to other aspects of their lives. Children who developed artistic abilities began approaching academic challenges with increased creativity and persistence. Parents who connected with other families through foundation events formed support networks that helped them navigate difficulties that had previously felt overwhelming. Young adults who learned technical skills in David's workshop went on to find employment that provided both economic stability and personal satisfaction. Elderly volunteers who shared expertise with foundation participants found renewed sense of purpose and community connection that improved their health and overall quality of life. These changes, while profound for the individuals directly affected, also contributed to improved outcomes for the neighborhood as a whole. Reduced crime, increased civic participation, better school performance, successful small business development, property value appreciation that reflected desirability rather than displacement of longtime residents. The success of community-based programming had attracted attention from researchers, policymakers, and foundation boards in other cities, leading to site visits, case studies, and replication efforts that honored the original model while adapting to local conditions and priorities. But for community members, the value of their association wasn't in its potential for expansion or its recognition by experts, but in the daily reality of living in a place where people cared about each other's well-being, where individual struggles were met with community support, where shared celebrations multiplied everyone's joy, where the future felt hopeful because present efforts were producing visible improvements in conditions that affected everyone's daily life. The question of what happens after transformation, how changed lives maintain their new direction, how reformed priorities withstand the pressures that originally led to destructive choices, how communities built around shared values adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential character, was being answered through the daily choices of everyone whose life had been touched by the unlikely friendship between a wealthy, isolated businessman and a wise young flower seller, whose gifts transcended rational explanation. Jonathan's commitment to his new priorities had been tested repeatedly through opportunities to return to more lucrative but less meaningful business activities, through social pressure from former colleagues who questioned his philanthropic focus, through moments of doubt about whether his contributions actually made difference proportional to the resources invested. But each test had confirmed rather than undermined his conviction that wealth was valuable only when it served purposes larger and more lasting than individual accumulation, that success was meaningful only when it contributed to conditions that allowed other people to flourish, that happiness was possible only when it was shared with people whose well-being mattered as much as his own. Maria's continued development as an artist and community leader had remained grounded in the humility and generosity that had first attracted attention to her unusual gifts. Her growing recognition in professional art circles hadn't changed her daily presence on the church steps, her availability to younger children who needed encouragement and guidance, her commitment to using whatever platform she gained to advocate for people and communities that were rarely heard in mainstream conversations about culture and creativity. Her artwork had evolved to include public murals that transformed abandoned buildings into community landmarks, collaborative installations that engaged entire neighborhoods in creative expression, and traveling exhibitions that brought community-based art to museums and galleries where it challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between artistic value and economic resources. The foundation itself had become a model for community development that was studied and replicated internationally, but its local impact remained the primary focus of everyone involved in its day-to-day operations. The programs that had grown from Jonathan and Maria's initial connection now served more than 1,000 children and family members annually. But their success was measured not in numbers served, but in depth and sustainability of changes facilitated in participants' lives and community conditions. As the story of Jonathan and Maria entered its 7th year, the question was no longer whether their unlikely friendship had produced lasting change, but how that change would continue to evolve and multiply through the lives of everyone it had touched. The community garden had become a year-round food source that supplemented family nutrition while providing educational opportunities that connected environmental awareness with economic empowerment and community health. The workshop cooperative had grown into a network of small businesses that provided living wages for dozens of former participants while creating products that served community needs and reflected community values. The arts programming had established pathways for talented young people to access advanced training and professional opportunities while maintaining connections to the neighborhood and values that had nurtured their initial development. The scholarship programs had enabled hundreds of young people to pursue higher education while remaining committed to community service and social justice. Most importantly, the network of relationships built around shared commitment to beauty, generosity, and mutual support had created a model for urban community building that honored cultural diversity while establishing common ground around fundamental human needs for recognition, opportunity, and connection. The ripple effects of this work extended far beyond San Francisco to include similar initiatives that had been inspired by foundation programming, policy changes that reflected lessons learned through community-based approaches to education and social service delivery, and individual transformation stories that demonstrated the possibility of redemption and healing even when circumstances seemed hopeless. The mystery of how a chance encounter between two strangers had generated such widespread positive change remained as inexplicable as Maria's original insights into Jonathan's deepest wounds and greatest needs. But the reality of that change, documented in lives rebuilt, communities strengthened, and hope restored where it had been abandoned, provided evidence that miracles still occurred, not through supernatural intervention, but through ordinary people's extraordinary commitment to seeing the best in each other and working together to create conditions where that goodness could flourish. And have you ever been offered a flower by someone whose motives seemed too pure to believe, whose generosity challenged your assumptions about human nature? Whose presence in your life arrived at exactly the moment when you most needed reminding that beauty and kindness still existed in the world? Have you ever been the person offering unexpected grace to a stranger, sharing whatever gifts you possessed without calculating returns, trusting that seeds planted in faith would find soil and sunlight sufficient for whatever growth was meant to occur? These questions matter because the miracle of transformation doesn't end with one person's story, but multiplies through everyone who recognizes their own capacity to serve as messenger and recipient, teacher, and student, planted seed and nurturing soil in the endless cycle of healing that becomes possible when we dare to believe that love really can find a way, that it's never too late to bloom again, that the smallest gestures of hope and kindness can change the world one heart at a time, one friendship at a time, one community at a time, until the accumulated weight of all that choosing light over darkness, connection over isolation, generosity over fear, creates momentum toward the kind of world where every child can grow up surrounded by beauty, and every adult can find purpose, and every community can thrive, because everyone understands that we're all connected, all deserving of dignity and opportunity, all capable of contributing something valuable to the vast human project of creating a future worth sharing.